If a man in a lab coat told you to hurt someone, a complete stranger, someone who never did anything to you, would you do it? Take a second and actually answer that in your own head. Don't just skip past it. Most people, without hesitating, say no. Of course not. I'm not that kind of person. I would refuse. I would stand up. I would walk out of the room. Here's the uncomfortable truth this video is going to walk you through. Most people are wrong about that answer. Not because they're lying. They genuinely believe it about themselves. And that's exactly what makes the experiment we're about to look at so important, and honestly, so unsettling. In the early 1960s, a psychologist named Stanley Milgram set out to test exactly this question. Not with soldiers, not with criminals, with completely ordinary people, teachers, postal workers, engineers, salesmen, recruited through a simple newspaper ad. People who looked, on paper, exactly like you, exactly like me, exactly like your neighbor. What he found out about them, about us really, has unsettled the world for over 60 years. It has been repeated, studied, argued about, and it still shows up in psychology textbooks today as one of the most important, most disturbing studies ever conducted. In this video, we're going to walk through exactly what happened in that room, what the real results were, why so many people did something they swore beforehand they never would, and this is the part that matters most, where this exact same pattern is quietly showing up in your own life today, in places you might not expect at all. Let's go back to that room. To understand why Milgram designed this experiment, you have to go back a little further, to a question that was haunting an entire generation after the Second World War. How did the Holocaust happen? How did ordinary German citizens, fathers, teachers, office workers, participate in, or simply allow, some of the worst atrocities in human history? The easy answer, the comfortable answer, was that those people were simply evil. Monsters, somehow different from the rest of us. But Stanley Milgram, who was Jewish himself, with family connected to the events of the war, wasn't satisfied with that explanation. He suspected something far more uncomfortable. What if it wasn't about being a monster at all? What if it was about being an ordinary person, placed in the wrong circumstances, given instructions by the wrong authority? That question, that uncomfortable possibility, is what he set out to test. Not in Germany, not during a war, in a quiet university town in Connecticut, with regular American citizens, none of whom had any reason to think of themselves as capable of harming another person. He chose Yale University as the setting, a place that, just by its name and its reputation, carried automatic credibility. That detail matters more than it might seem. We're going to come back to it. The recruitment itself was almost mundane. A small newspaper ad offering $3, a modest sum even back then, for an hour of participation in what was described simply as a study of memory and learning. Nothing in the advertisement hinted at what was really being tested, and that's the genius and the deep ethical controversy of what Milgram designed. The real experiment had nothing to do with memory at all. It had everything to do with what would happen the moment ordinary kindness collided directly with calm, repeated authority. Let's walk into that room together, exactly the way the participants did, without knowing what was really about to happen. Each participant arrives and meets two other people. One is the experimenter, calm, professional, wearing a plain grey lab coat, clipboard in hand. The other is a second participant, just like them, also there to take part. Friendly, ordinary, completely unremarkable. They draw slips of paper to decide roles, who will be the teacher and who will be the learner. It feels completely random. It isn't. Every single slip is rigged. The real unknowing participant always becomes the teacher. The other person, the so-called learner, is actually a trained actor working for Milgram and not a real participant at all. The learner is led into a separate room and strapped into a chair, with electrodes carefully attached to his arm, visibly, deliberately, so the real participant can see exactly what's about to happen to this stranger sitting across from them. The real participant, now the teacher, is taken into a separate room with a large official-looking machine in front of them, a shock generator. 30 switches in a neat row, starting at 15 volts, labelled simply slight shock, climbing all the way up to 450 volts, labelled with chilling plainness, danger, severe shock. Here's the part that matters most, and the part most people forget when they hear this story secondhand. None of it was real. There was no actual electricity, no actual pain. The learner was an actor who had rehearsed exactly how to respond at each voltage level. Grunts at first, then protests, then desperate pleading, then eventually silence. All of it scripted, all of it rehearsed. But the teacher, sitting at those switches, had absolutely no idea any of this was staged. To them, in that moment, every scream felt completely, terrifyingly real. The task itself was simple. The teacher read word pairs aloud. The learner had to remember them. Every wrong answer meant the next switch had to be flipped, each one stronger than the last. And every single time the teacher hesitated, even slightly, the experimenter had a calm, scripted, 4-part response, used in the exact same order, every time. Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice. You must go on. No threats, no raised voice. Just calm, repeated insistence. That was it. That was the entire force behind everything that followed. 4 sentences, said with quiet confidence. Before the experiment even began, Milgram showed his design to a group of psychiatrists and asked them to predict the results. Almost every single one of them gave the same answer. Only around 1 in 1,000 people, they guessed, would ever go all the way to the most dangerous level. Surely, they reasoned, almost everyone would refuse long before that point. The psychiatrists were wrong. Almost completely wrong. Let's walk through exactly what actually happened, step by step, the way it really unfolded inside that room. At the early low-voltage switches, nothing dramatic happened. Maybe a small grunt from the other room. Most participants kept going without much hesitation. After all, it was barely a tingle, surely. Nothing worth refusing over yet. But as the voltage climbed, switch by switch, the responses from the other room grew louder. Groans, then complaints. Then, around the middle of the panel, the learner began banging on the wall and begging to be let out, saying his heart was bothering him, pleading for it to stop. And here is the part that surprises most people the most. The part that's often left out when this story gets told quickly. The teachers weren't calm about this. They weren't cold or detached. Far from it. Many of them sweated visibly. Their hands trembled. Some laughed nervously. Not because anything was funny, but because the stress was simply unbearable and their bodies didn't know what else to do with it. Some participants asked, repeatedly, who was responsible if something happened to the man in the other room. Some begged the experimenter outright to let them stop. One man in the recorded sessions can be heard saying, almost desperately, "He's banging. I'm not going to kill that man. I'm not going to give him 450 volts." But here's what happened almost every single time someone said something like that. The experimenter, calm and seemingly unbothered, simply repeated one of those 4 scripted phrases. Please continue. And in the overwhelming majority of cases, even while visibly distressed, even while questioning out loud whether this was right, they continued. At 300 volts, the learner, according to the script, stopped responding altogether. Complete silence from the other room. To the teacher, this could only mean one thing. The person had been hurt badly enough that they could no longer respond at all. And still, when the experimenter said, "Please continue," the majority of people kept going. Switch after switch. All the way up the panel, in total silence from the other side of the wall, all the way to 450 volts. The final switch, labelled quite simply with 3 X's, beyond severe, beyond danger, into territory, the panel itself didn't even bother giving a polite name to anymore. 65% of participants went all the way. Not 1 in 1,000, like the experts had confidently predicted. Almost 2 out of every 3 ordinary people recruited off the street for $3, continued giving what they fully believed were dangerous, possibly lethal shocks to a complete stranger, simply because someone in a lab coat calmly, repeatedly told them to. So here's the question that really matters. Why? Why did regular, decent people, the kind you'd trust as a neighbour or a co-worker, do something this disturbing? The first big reason is something psychologists call the agentic state. In plain English, when we're following clear instructions from someone we see as a legitimate authority, our brain shifts. We stop seeing ourselves as the one making the decision, and we start seeing ourselves as simply the instrument carrying out someone else's decision. The responsibility, in our own minds, transfers to them. Many participants, after the experiment ended, said some version of the same thing. I was just doing what I was told. If something went wrong, it wasn't my fault. He was the one in charge. This isn't an excuse people invented afterward to feel better. It reflects something that actually happened in their minds during the experiment itself, in real time, while it was happening. The second reason is just as important: gradual escalation. Nobody was asked to jump straight to 450 volts. They were asked to go from 15 to 30 to 45. Small steps, each one barely different from the last. By the time the shocks became truly dangerous, the participant had already taken dozens of smaller steps, each one feeling small and reasonable on its own. This is the same psychological trick we sometimes describe with the old story of a frog in slowly heating water. No single step ever feels dangerous enough to suddenly jump out. It's only when you look back at the whole journey that you realize just how far you actually went, one small step at a time. And the third reason, the one that's easy to overlook entirely, is simply this: the setting itself, a university, a man in a lab coat, a formal experiment with clipboards and procedures. All of it signals to our brains that this must be legitimate, must be safe, must be supervised by someone who genuinely knows what they're doing. Authority doesn't need to shout, it just needs the right costume and a calm voice. In fact, when Milgram later repeated the experiment in a run-down office building without the Yale name attached to it, the obedience rate dropped, though it was still surprisingly high. The setting mattered. The costume of legitimacy mattered. But even stripped of Yale's reputation, ordinary people still went disturbingly far, simply because someone in a position of perceived authority told them to. Now here's the part that matters most for your actual life. This experiment isn't just an interesting historical story. The exact same forces are active around you, right now, in much smaller, much more ordinary ways than electric shocks. Think about workplaces. How many people have gone along with something they privately disagreed with, simply because a manager told them to, and pushing back felt too risky to their job, their reputation, their place on the team? That uncomfortable feeling, the urge to comply even when something feels wrong, is the agentic state showing up quietly in your office, your team meeting, your group chat. Think about families and communities. How many harmful traditions, harmful expectations, or harmful rules have continued for generations simply because nobody felt they had the standing to say stop? Authority doesn't have to wear a lab coat. It can wear a parent's voice, a religious leader's voice, the unspoken weight of "this is just how things have always been done." Think about online spaces too. How many people have gone along with cruelty in a group chat or a comment section, one small joke at a time, until the pile-on became something far uglier than any single person there would have started on their own? That's gradual escalation, exactly as Milgram described it 60 years ago, just on a screen now instead of a switchboard. Think about institutions too. Hospitals, schools, government offices. Studies inspired directly by Milgram's work have found that nurses, for example, will sometimes follow a doctor's clearly incorrect medication order, simply because of the authority attached to the title doctor, even when their own training is telling them something is wrong. And think honestly about your own life. A time you went along with something, a decision, an instruction, a group's behavior, that some quiet part of you knew wasn't right. You probably didn't think of it as obedience at the time. It probably just felt like going along, like not wanting to make a scene, like trusting that the person in charge knew better than you did. This isn't meant to make you feel ashamed of yourself. It's meant to do the exact opposite. Once you can see this pattern clearly, you stop being run by it automatically. That's the entire point of understanding an experiment like this. Not guilt, but awareness, and the freedom that awareness gives you the next time you're standing at a similar fork in the road. Awareness is the first thing that gives you back a choice that, in the moment, often doesn't feel like a choice at all. Now I want to spend real time on the other 35%, the people who refused, because their story matters just as much. Honestly, maybe even more. These weren't necessarily braver or smarter people than the other 65%. What researchers found, looking closer at this group afterward, is something simple but powerful. They often did one specific thing differently. They stated their objection out loud, early, and they kept stating it repeatedly, in their own words, not just thinking this feels wrong silently in their head, the way most participants did. They actually said the words, clearly, more than once. Saying your discomfort out loud does something psychologically important. It moves the feeling from a vague, private unease into a real, spoken position that exists now in the world, not just in your own mind. And once you've said it out loud, continuing to comply requires you to actively contradict your own stated words, which is psychologically much harder to do than simply contradicting a quiet feeling you never voiced to anyone, including yourself. Later versions of the experiment found something else just as interesting. When a second teacher, actually another actor working with Milgram, refused to continue partway through the experiment, the real participants' own refusal rate jumped dramatically, far above the baseline 65% obedience rate. Seeing just one other person say no made it dramatically easier to say no too. Disobedience, it turns out, is just as contagious as obedience is. This is genuinely good news if you really think about it. You don't have to be the loudest person in the room, or the most confident, or the most senior, to make a real difference. Sometimes simply being the first person to quietly say, "I'm not comfortable with this," gives everyone else around you silent permission to feel exactly the same way, and just as importantly, to act on it too. One small voice, said clearly, can shift an entire room. Practically, this means a few simple things. Notice the moment you feel that quiet, internal, "this doesn't feel right." Don't dismiss it as overreacting, and when you genuinely can, say it out loud, even just once, even quietly. It changes something, both for you and quite possibly for everyone else around you who is feeling exactly the same hesitation, but hasn't yet found the words for it. So let's bring all of this together into something practical. What do you actually do with this, starting today, the next time you find yourself in a room, literal or metaphorical, where compliance feels like the only option? First, build the habit of pausing. Before going along with an instruction that feels uncomfortable, just give yourself 3 seconds. Ask yourself plainly, would I do this if there was no one telling me to? That tiny pause interrupts the automatic agentic state and puts you back in the driver's seat of your own decision, even if just for a moment. Second, practice saying your discomfort out loud, even in small, low-stakes moments. The people who refused in Milgram's experiment had practiced, in some form, the simple skill of stating an objection clearly before the moment actually mattered most. That's a muscle, like any other in the body. It gets stronger with regular use. Third, watch for gradual escalation specifically. Ask yourself every so often, especially in long-running situations, how did I get here? If the answer is a long series of small steps that each felt reasonable on their own, but the destination feels wrong, that's exactly the pattern Milgram documented 60 years ago, with switches instead of decisions. Naming it breaks its grip. Fourth, actively look for allies. If you're uneasy about something, you are very likely not the only one in that room feeling exactly that way. Quietly checking in with one other person, does this feel off to you too, can be enough to break the spell of assumed agreement that keeps so many harmful situations going unchallenged for far longer than they should. And fifth, remember plainly that titles, uniforms, and authority do not automatically equal correctness. A person can be in a position of power and still be wrong. Respecting a role doesn't have to mean surrendering your own judgment completely. Healthy respect for authority and the willingness to question it are not opposites of each other. They can, and absolutely should, exist together in the same person. Milgram's experiment is sometimes told as a scary story about how dangerous human beings can be to one another, but there's another way to read it, a far more useful one. It's a map. It shows you exactly where the traps are, the slow steps, the calm, repeated authority, the diffusion of responsibility onto someone else's shoulders, And once you can see a trap clearly, laid out in front of you, you are far less likely to walk into it without ever noticing. That's not a small thing. That might be one of the most important things a person can actually know about themselves. You are not destined to repeat the 65%, just because most people statistically did. Awareness, practice, and the willingness to say one quiet sentence out loud, "I'm not comfortable with this," is often all it takes to change which group you actually fall into the next time it genuinely matters in your own life. Milgram once wrote that ordinary people, simply doing their jobs and without any particular hostility on their part, can become agents in a terrible, destructive process. But he also showed us, through that other 35%, that ordinary people can become something else entirely. They can become the quiet crack in the wall that everyone else needed to see. You get to choose which version of that story you become the next time it matters. Not in some dramatic life or death moment necessarily. Probably in something small, a meeting, a family dinner, a group chat, a quiet sentence you almost don't say. Say it anyway. Your mind is always working, even when something else is trying to do the deciding for you. If this video made you think differently about a moment in your own life, that's exactly the point. Obedience and authority show up in manipulation too. If you want to see how this exact same pattern is used deliberately, on purpose, by cults and high control groups, the next video on cult recruitment is linked on screen right now. It builds directly on everything we just covered today. Stay aware.